Today's video, I just want to do a quick Q&A. A lot of people have been asking me a few questions on the sawmill, and I thought it'd be nice to just share everybody's questions in one video. And hopefully, if I answer these questions, somebody will find it kind of relevant. You're looking to buy a similar sawmill and, kind of interested on what's going on. Okay, so let's get started. First question I got asked a lot is, how long do the blades last before they need sharpened? And it's kind of a tricky question. It depends on what you're cutting. If you're cutting the softwood, it lasts a lot longer than if you're cutting the hardwoods. If you're cutting oak and ash and those kinds of logs, I would say you're going to get probably about 2-3 logs, and you're going to need to do some kind of sharpening, at least just touch it up a little bit. Now, if you're doing a softer log like pine, you might get 5 to 7 logs, I would say, before you're going to have to sharpen your blade. Now, if you hit a piece of metal or you hit a stone in your log, then you're going to have some problems with your blade. If you knock the tip off of a couple teeth, you're going to have a lot of problems with your blade, and you're going to need some major remodeling on your blade to get it to be back up to snuff. Now, if you don't hit any metal and you don't hit any stones and there's no other debris or anything that you hit with it, and you're just cutting wood, really all you need is just a file and just kind of reshape the edges, and all you're really looking to do is just make everything back to a square point. As you're cutting, it just kind of takes the end of the sawtooth and just dulls it out a little bit. It doesn't have that square point, it just kind of rounds the edges off, and it doesn't cut as well. So you just have to take a file and sharpen the edges up a little bit, and you'll be right back in business again. So that's kind of as best an answer I give you on that. It depends on how many logs you cut, depends on what type of wood you're cutting, and in general you're only going to get a couple logs before you need to do some touch up. It's just like a chainsaw. If you do any kind of woodworking, you do any kind of tree cutting, you know that you can take a chainsaw, you put a new chain on it, you can cut pretty good with a new chain for a while. And if you just keep cutting with it and keep cutting with it and keep cutting with it and keep cutting with it, it's going to get real dull and it becomes a nightmare to sharpen. But if you cut a couple cuts and you take a file and you just run a file through each one of the teeth, you can keep it pretty sharp and keep it going for a long period of time, and you can keep using that chain on the chainsaw for an extended period of time. It's the same concept on these saws. You have a saw blade, if you take care of it, you don't hit anything with it, and you just take every so often and just kind of touch it up. It's a lot better than if you run it completely into the ground and have to try to remodel it. I say remodel, but you know what I mean. Once you take the tip off of a tooth, it's tough to get it back into that shape. If you just take a file and just give it a few swipes, you'll be right back in, put it right back where it was. Okay, I'm kind of rambling on a little bit, but trying to get the point across as best I can. How many times can you sharpen your blades before you need a new blade? And again, this question kind of relates a lot to the last question. Again, if you hit something, I've already hit a piece of metal. If you hit your upright post, that's pretty much a done deal. That blade's going to be garbage. If you hit a lot of metal in a log, I've hit nails and screws and things that are in logs that you don't even notice you hit them. The saw blade actually just goes right through and doesn't even hesitate, and you don't even notice it. And to be honest with you, if you look at the blade, there might be a little bit of deformation on one of the tips, but there's really not much to it. If you hit a lag bolt or a piece of steel, something in a piece of wire, that's going to mess the blade up pretty quick, and it might just be no good at that point. So again, that's kind of a tricky question, but if you don't hit anything, I think, and if you keep on it, it's just like going back to the chainsaw idea. I think one blade will last you a very long time. Next question I have is, do you need to seal the end grain of the logs? Now, I answered this in not the last video, but a couple videos ago, and the quick and dirty answer to this is, if you don't want your boards to check, then yeah, you should seal the end grain on your logs. If you seal them up with some paint or some kind of sealer, they make end grain sealer, it keeps the end of your wood from splitting. When the wood dries, it dries faster on the end grain, the moisture comes out of the end and it shrinks the end. And the middle, it takes more time and it doesn't shrink as much. So what you're doing is you're constricting that end, and it splits because you're basically like putting a rubber band on one piece. It's pulling it and it's putting tension in it, and it splits to get rid of that tension. So if you put the end sealer on there, it all kind of dries the same way. None of the moisture, or very little of the moisture, comes out of the end grain. It all comes out of the face. and the sides, and it just has more of an even dry to it, so it tends not to split. Now, if you're only cutting pine, with my experiences, I've cut a lot of pine. When I first got the saw, I got a very large pile of pine, and I didn't have any checking on it at all. I didn't seal any of the end grain. I just cut it, stacked it, air dried it, and it dried just fine. And I'll tell you what, I even used some of it for siding on the garage, the barn, whatever you want to call it, and none of that split, none of it checked. It was all really good stuff. So depending on what wood you're cutting too, I would say it depends on whether or not you want to put an end sealer on there. If you're doing hardwoods, I know ash splits like crazy. I know maple's a tough one. You know, oak, it just splits on the end if you don't put any kind of an end sealer on there. So is it worth investing in the end sealer? All depends on how much you want to spend and whether or not, you know, you're paying for your logs. If you're paying for your logs and you're selling your lumber, I would recommend you use an end grain sealer to preserve as much of that lumber as you can. If you're only using it for yourself for a hobby and you're only buying one of these small sawmills, personally I think it's easier just to cut that last foot or two off of the end of the board and throw that out. I'm cutting 10-foot boards. If I cut a foot off each end, I still have an 8-foot board that I have a lot of usable lumber. So even if I lose 1 or 2 boards, you know, that's not a big deal to me. So hope that answers that question. How much do my blades cost? You know, if you buy them from Woodland Mills, which is where I bought my sawmill, and if you're watching my videos, you know that I have a Woodland Mills sawmill. That's roughly $22, $23 a blade, I think it is right now. And they're Lennox saw blades, so they give you all the dimensions from Woodland Mills, and you can get them straight from Lennox through the internet, and they're roughly $20 a blade. Are you saving a lot of money? Not really, but a few dollars a blade. If you're buying 10 blades or more, you know, it adds up. So I recommend you just get them from Lennox. That's what I've been doing. You know, if somebody has a better solution, I'm all ears. You know, I'm an amateur at this at best. I'm just sharing with you my experiences. So if you guys have some better experiences or you guys have some more insight on this, you know, please feel free to comment in the sections below. But as far as I know, the Lennox blades seem to work the best. That's what they come with from the factory, so that's what I stick with, and it works pretty well. So my lumber, how long do you air dry the lumber? And the best answer I can give on this question is I've always been told roughly a year per inch. So if you cut your lumber to inch thick, which is what I do with most of my lumber, it's roughly 1 year per inch. And again, this depends a lot on how you dry it and what you do with it. I air dry my lumber. I didn't build a kiln yet. It's a project I want to do in the future. But for right now, air drying it, it's roughly 1 year per inch. So if I have 1 inch thick boards, I dry it for a year. I also find this also depends on the type of lumber you're trying to dry. Pine, I find that if you let it go for about 6 months, you're pretty well good with pine. It just dries quicker, it's a lighter wood, and it's a lot easier to dry out than it is the hardwoods. The hardwoods, I would definitely recommend at least a year. I took some oak that I had standing up by the sawmill underneath the roof, and it was there for probably about 7 months. And I actually probed it with my meter, and I was getting about 12-13%, which is, you know, pretty good for being just air dried. I took it in the garage, I ran it through the planer, and I left it sit on the floor, and it wanted to warp real bad because it just had too much moisture on the inside of it yet. I didn't buy a real good meter. I just had one of those cheap meters you probe into it. And if I'm getting between 10 and 13%, that's usually pretty good, you know, for air drying it. Now, most people, if you're going to build furniture, or if you're worried about splitting, I would say, you know, you want to kiln dry it, you want to get down to that 5% or so, which is roughly what a house is. When you have a house, you have a wood burner or coal stove, it gets the house very dry. And if you have lumber that you make at 13% and you take it in the house and it goes down to 5%, you run that risk of that same checking effect. You're going to have a split, especially on your wider boards. And if you're building furniture, you don't want to build a piece of furniture, have it go in the house and have it split. You know, bad things happen. But that's the idea behind running it through the kiln. You kiln dry it. Once you kiln dry and get that down to that 5%, and then you go and build your project out of it, and then you take it into a house. Or even if you leave it in the garage or something where it goes back to that 12-13%, between that 5 and 12, it kind of, you know, it's okay once it dries and it stays there. It's not a big deal. That's kind of why I want to build a kiln. It helps out with these bigger, wider boards. It keeps them from running that risk of splitting them when they dry a little bit more beyond that point. I'm getting off the topic here a little bit. Yeah, how long a year to dry your lumber? So, like I said, it's roughly a year per inch. So, if you're going to run some bigger boards, if you want to build the mantles or bar tops or tabletops 2 inches thick or 3 inches thick, it could be 2-3 years just air drying it. And I've also found that if you're air drying a lumber, it seems like it at that thickness it just doesn't want to dry. Even sitting for 2 years, I've still found that the wide boards just don't dry out as well. It's better if you kiln dry your wider stuff, in my opinion. So next question I have is, do the stickers need to be made of dry wood? And the answer to that is yes. And what you have is what they call sticker staining. Now, a sticker, to be clear, is the board that goes between the spacer you board you put in between your boards to keep airspace so that air can flow between your boards to dry your lumber out. And if you put wet lumber, when you first buy a sawmill and you don't have any stickers, you don't have any extra wood laying around, you cut your first your first log up and you have some end pieces and you're thinking, well, I can just cut these pieces up and use them for my stickers. You can, but you have what they call sticker staining. And what it basically is when you put a wet piece of wood up against another wet piece of wood, it molds. And that mold it stains the lumber, and no matter how many times you run it through the planer, generally it sticks with it and you can't really get it off of there. So you ruin the lumber, basically. It just ruins it. So in my experience, the best thing to do is, if you're first starting out and you don't have anything else laying around, take some scrap lumber you have laying around, or go out and buy furring strips. That's what I did with a lot of the lumber I first started with. I didn't have much for stickers, so I went and bought a couple packs of furring strips, cut them down to 4 foot, and then ran them through the table saw so that they're already 3/4 inch thick. So you just ran them through at a 3/4 inch gap on the table saw with the fence, and you wind up with a 3/4 by 3/4 sticker. And it's dry wood, so that alleviates the problem of having any mold on there. Now, while I'm on the subject of mold, I've come across a couple things here I wanted to share with you. When you cut your wood and you're running your lube on your saw, another question I had, I'll answer this question real quick, is how much lube do you need on your saw blade? And the best thing I found is a steady drip is a good amount of water on your saw blade. If you run too much water on the saw blade, it floods it out and you end up getting a big stain across the board with all the sawdust mixing with the water, and it makes a mess of your lumber and it's hard to get off, and then that molds and that causes problems too. So your lube that you put on your saw blade is just a mix of water, and I use Dawn dish soap, and all it is just to keep the blade from getting sapped up. And I have a couple other videos on that too as well. If you look through, you can see the one that I had. If you run it too heavy, it creates a slurry of sawdust and water, and if it gets hot and dries out, it gets like a sap and it sticks to the saw blade, and it just makes a mess of the saw blade where it won't cut straight, and it actually ruins the saw blade if it gets too hot. But back to the idea though, the question was, how much lube do you need? Just a steady drip. Just a steady drip is just enough to keep the blade cool and keep the blade from getting any buildup on it. And the other thing I found is you're best off to stop every other log or every log and look at your saw blade a little bit. If it's starting to get a buildup on it, take a piece of emery cloth and just kind of sand it down a little bit. A little bit of Dawn dish soap or a little bit of gasoline or a little bit of diesel fuel even or something will just take that stuff right off of there, and you just kind of wipe it off your blade every so often to keep the buildup from building up too high on your saw blade. What I was trying to get to, and I'm kind of all over the place here, I'm sorry about that, but when you're done cutting your lumber, when you run your sawmill and you get the first couple slabs off and you're starting to get some usable lumber, the lumber you get there, I recommend you take a broom and sweep the sawdust off it, because the sawdust mixing with the water that you're running for your lube for your saw blade will mold your wood. if you take a broom and just brush it off right away, then when you stack it, it dries out nice, and you don't have that extra water and sawdust on there to stain your wood. It doesn't create that moisture. When you put your stickers on top of that wet water that you're using to lubricate your blade, and it just sandwiches between the sticker and the board, and then you're having that same sticker stain, you're having that same mold effect. So if you just take a broom and sweep it off, I find that it's easy to just sweep it, and then when you're stacking it, you know, you move your lumber around, you're flipping your lumber, you put your stickers on it. I haven't had any issue when I just sweep them off. And if you're using the right amount of lube, you might not even need to sweep them off. But just something I wanted to pass along with you. Now that's all the questions I have for now. If you guys have any more questions that you want me to answer, you know, just leave them in the comments below, or just leave them in the comments in any of my videos, and I will definitely get back to you. I'll answer you as best I can. Like I said, I'm still learning things as I go. I'm no professional, but if you're looking into buying one of these sawmills, they're not cheap, and it's just nice to kind of know what to look for to start off with. You know, a lot of things I've learned through reading and through other experiences of other people, and I just like to pass along every little bit of wisdom I can to try to help people out. If you have any other questions, leave them in the comments below. I'll get back to you. And if I get enough questions built up, I'll do another Q&A video, and I'll just group them all together and answer them, so that way other people that might be looking for the same questions, I can answer them all at one time. So until next time, thanks for watching. I'll see you.